everyone, I am Kesmer Kalipapa, a first-year college student of Bachelor of Physical Education, Section B. Today, I will demonstrate and identify to you all anatomical terms of movements or joints movement on how can they execute and to know where parts of our body can do that movement. Also, what called that movement it is. So we have 16 anatomical terms of movement which are the flexion, extension, hyperextension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, abduction, adduction, pronation, supination, circumduction, inversion, eversion, retraction, protraction, elevation, and lastly, the depression. Okay, those are the anatomical terms that I would demonstrate and identify. But before we will start, always refer to the anatomic position. Whenever we're thinking about position or motion, this is forever and all starting point in anatomy. So how do we do that? So how do we do the anatomic position? First, just stand straight forward, just like this. Then your eyes must be looking forward. Then your palm or your arms must be forward also, just like this. And just stay calm. What are you waiting for? Let's start! The first anatomical term of movement that I would identify and demonstrate is the flexion. When we say flexion, we're referring to decreasing or minimizing the joint angle, or we can say that it is a forward movement of a whole limb or any part of the limb. So for use this definition, you can have flexion of your shoulder, just like this. It's a shoulder flexion. It's the elbow flexion. Just like that. Hip flexion. Knee flexion. Thumb flexion. Wrist flexion. Next is extension. When we say extension, we're referring that increasing or maximizing the joint angle, conversely, the flexion backward movement of limb or any part of the limb. So for use this definition, you can have extension of the shoulder. Shoulder extension. Elbow extension. Hip extension. Knee extension. Thumb extension. Wrist extension. Hyperextension is when you extend beyond the joint angle or extending a body part past the normal anatomical position. So for use this definition, you can have hyperextension to your hip joint. Hip hyperextension. Finger hyperextension. The athlete who commonly use this movement is those who are in a gymnastic world or the gymnastics people. Next is dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So in this type of flexion, we can use the ankle joint to flex. Dorsiflexion is when we bring the foot or the toes up towards the top of the body, that is dorsiflexion, pointing the toes upward. And plantar flexion is pointing the toes down to the ground, just like planting something in the ground. Dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion. Next is abduction. When the upper limb is moved away in the vertical midline axis of the body. So for use as a definition, you can have the abduction of the arm, leg or the hip, fingers, and also the wrist. Abduction of the arm. Abduction of the leg. Abduction of the fingers. Abduction of the wrist. When the movement of the limb toward the midline axis of the body is called adduction. For use as a definition, you can have adduction of the arm, leg or the hip, fingers, and also the wrist. Adduction of the arm. Adduction of the leg. Adduction of the fingers. Adduction of the wrist. Pronation and supination is capable to use our forearm to having a specialized in rotating movement, and inward rotation of a forearm is referred to as a pronation, facing downward, and returning to an original position of a forearm constitute as supination. Just like taking a some swoop, just to remember it. Pronation, supination. Next is circumduction. Circumduction is moving the joint in the circle around the axis. It is composed of the internal rotation and the external rotation. A sequential combination movement is referred to the shoulder, the hip, and also the ankle. Shoulder joint. Hip circumduction. Ankle circumduction. Inversion and eversion is when referring to the foot. The inversion is when inward rotation of the foot whereby the medial border elevated, and the opposite movement whereby the lateral border or the foot is eversion. Inversion. Eversion. Retraction is the opposite motion of the scapula, being pulled posteriorly or medially toward the vertebral column. So for use as a definition, you can retract your shoulder and your jaw. Shoulder retraction. Jaw retraction. Protraction is movement of a body part in the anterior direction. Example is this is being drawn forward. So for this definition, you can protract your shoulder and also your jaw. Shoulder protraction. Jaw protraction. And the last two anatomical terms of movement are the elevation and depression. Elevation is the upward superior motion of the scapula or the mandible, and depression is a downward interior motion of scapula or mandible. Shoulder elevation. Shoulder depression. Jaw elevation. Jaw depression. So that was the end of my practical 2 for having a demonstration and identification of anatomical terms of movement or joint movement. Again, I am Kesmer Kalipapa. Thank you and God bless.